Today we're going to talk a little bit about building rich applications for Salesforce1 with Ionic and AngularJS. If you've ever done Ionic or AngularJS, raise your hand. Actually, I need you to shout because I've got some easy bake oven lights facing me here, and I see nothing out there. So help me out. If you've done Angular or Ionic, say something. Whoa, okay, so we've got some people who are excited about it. A little bit about me. My name's Kevin Poorman. I am a principal architect at EDL Consulting. I'm also a Force.com MVP. I've been doing Ionic and Angular on Visualforce for about 2 years now. So right as Angular was first picking up some steam, I started throwing it on Visualforce and playing with it. And this is sort of the fruits of my labors over the past couple of years. You get to learn all about the quote-unquote best practices. That sounds very business-like, so I'm going to go with good ideas. Does that sound better? We have an agenda for today. It looks a little bit like this. We're going to talk a little bit about Angular and what it is. We're going to cap that at 90 seconds. That's for people who've never heard of Angular. We're going to look at the Ionic Framework and what it is on top of Angular. We're going to have we're going to talk a little bit about how to do Ionic and Angular on top of Visualforce. So we keep adding layers to our stack here. We're going to talk about how we can mix client-side and server-side controllers, so we can use Apex controllers as well as JavaScript controllers. Deal with some in-app navigation issues. We're going to expose our app to Salesforce1, and then we're going to look at the actual code for the app that we've built here, walk through it line by line, and demo how it all comes together and what it looks like inside Salesforce1. At the end, we'll have a little bit of a recap and then some questions and answers. If you don't ask me questions, I will ask you questions, like, why don't you follow me on Twitter? Or something other equally embarrassing. So come up with questions. It'll be good. This is the interactive session you didn't know you were coming to. Let's start this off. AngularJS in 90 seconds. Angular is a project from Google. It's maintained by some Google folks, some very bright guys. It is a model view / view model JavaScript application framework from, well, like I said, Google. So if you are familiar with doing apps on Visualforce, you're familiar with the MVC pattern, right? Model view, view model works a little bit differently. You have your views, you have your models, and in between them you have a ad hoc, just-in-time model created with just the data needed to display everything in the view. So it's not a traditional controller. There may be functions and that sort of stuff. And oftentimes you'll hear people in the Angular space call it a controller, but it is actually a view model, not a true controller. Angular likes to talk about how it's enterprise ready. And when Google is developing something and then they say they use it, I don't know why they have to say it's enterprise ready, but they like to point out that it's enterprise ready. And they say things like, you get to use dependency injection. And we'll see what that means for Angular and Ionic and for us on the platform here in a little bit. But that also means you get to do things like testing. It makes it pretty easy to test. And if you've ever done Java development in an enterprise, the tools you're expecting to use there, or at least the theory behind those tools, you also get to apply in Angular almost one-to-one. Now those tools will have different formats and names and that sort of thing because it's a different ecosystem, but they're there and the theory is there. And last but probably the most importantly, we have the most powerful and least documented part of Angular is this thing called a directive. A directive is a framework that allows us as developers to teach HTML5 new tricks. So using directives and directive files, we'll be able to create new tags that the browser will then render that have their own controllers, their own views, and even their own models if necessary. Those then become reusable. It's a lot like a Lightning component, and that is a component that you can drop anywhere in your view or your controller, your view model, to reuse. So, like I said, they're infinite cosmic power, itty-bitty documentation. Ionic is a library that is getting better and better every day of pre-built Angular directives. And along with those directives, we have some CSS, some predefined views, and some icons. The Ionicons, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, are some of the best flat navigation UI icons you'll see out there for free. We get to use them along with their pre-built-in templates whenever we use an Ionic directive. So we'll be able to do something like, say, give me an Ionic list as a directive, and then that will format, polish up, give us icons and everything else for a list of data. We'll see that here in a little bit. One of the great parts about Ionic is that they've built this as a generator for Cordova apps, as well as being able to be used outside of Cordova. So if you were writing an application and you want to put it in Salesforce1 and you want to release it as its own app on the App Store for Apple or Google, or I think you can now do it for Microsoft apps, you can totally do that with Ionic. You can just generate a new Ionic project using their Cordova plugin, and it'll build it all out for you. We're going to focus on not the Cordova side of things, but actually using it in our own stack on Visualforce. And last but not least, I wanted to provide the URL where you can find out more, see all of their beautiful artwork, is ionicframework.com. I tried to highlight, italicize, and make that, drawn out there, but PowerPoint won't let me. It wants to make it look just like it does on their site. So ionicframework.com, that's their URL. Now, I talked about directives and how they provide a way to teach HTML5 and browsers new tricks, how to do things with a very terse syntax. So we have components that we want to use, these directives that we want to put in our application, and a lot of them should seem very familiar to you if you've ever done mobile development. So if you get the idea of a side menu, so if you've used Salesforce1 and you've gone to stage left, say something, right? We're going to have a side menu that's going to act a lot like stage left, only because Salesforce1 has stage left. In our app, we're going to do stage right. Very good. Very good. Ionic also has directives that help you build out navigation, headers and footers, form inputs to make it look consistent across all the platforms, modal dialogues, little alert messages that pop up, popovers, which are similar but not quite modals. Then we also have action sheets. We get, who's seen the nice little spinning loading icon when an app starts up? Yeah? We can do those pretty easily with Ionic. Tabs, list, tap and click. A lot of these are standard stuff that we're probably all very familiar with, if only by name or concept. Ionic has provided directives for us that we can just throw those in our views and they're pulled in for us automatically. One I do want to highlight, this tap and click one. The guys at Ionic, the people who back it, are some real geniuses, and they've come up with a way to overcome the 300 millisecond delay in a Cordova-based app that happens when you click something. So if you've ever been using a hybrid app that's been written in JavaScript and you click a button and it sits there and waits for almost half a second before doing anything about it, they've found a way to get beyond that and to turn that off wherever you need to. So if you want an immediate action on a button, you can put it inside a tap and click directive and it will immediately go, which is pretty fabulous. So this is what our total stack looks like. We have Ionic, which is going to provide directives and CSS. It's also going to provide some icons for us, but I didn't put that one in there. We have Angular, which is going to give us client-side controllers that are going to act as our view models. We also have application logic, which in Angular we call services. That's going to be provided, and they're going to run client-side. In the gray here at the bottom, we have server-side controllers and all of the standard Salesforce security that comes along with that. So when we're using Ionic and Angular on top of Visualforce, we're backed by all of the standard security, sharing rules, all of the object field security information that is configured by your administrator point and click wise in Salesforce. This is very powerful because you can tie it to the profile of whoever is using it, whether or not they can see certain fields. You gain the ability to show administrators more fields in your views than the sales guy down the street. Running Ionic applications on Visualforce and therefore inside Salesforce1 is not without its own set of perils. And so there are a couple of things that I want to draw your attention to. When you're creating a Visualforce page to hold an Ionic app, there are certain options that you'll get to see here in just a few minutes that tie in and display, and actually they direct Salesforce on how to render the page. There are things like the doc type. You want to manually set the doc type to HTML5. You definitely want to turn off the header and the sidebar of your Visualforce page. That's going to cramp your style pretty badly. And you need to tell Salesforce not to include its standard CSS. Those 4 tags, when they're put in there inside your Apex page, will help get any Angular project off the ground, but they're essential for an Ionic application. So I'll pull those out here in a little bit when we're looking at the code. Second one I want to draw to your attention is use components. What I mean by components is not a JavaScript component as in like a Lightning component or what some people would directive in Angular. I mean, you want to use Visualforce components, and here's why. When you're doing an Ionic or a Visualforce page with Angular Ionic on it, you're going to end up with 50, 75, 100 lines of include this file, include this file, include this file. And that gets unwieldy, especially in your views. Put them in a component and draw that component into your Visualforce page. I'll demonstrate that here as well. Another benefit you get of doing that is if you have them in a component, you can determine whether the component loads from your local host or from the Salesforce server. If you're doing a local development and you're just making quick changes to your controllers and to your models, etc. in Ionic, you want to be able to base this off of your local host so that you see the changes quickly. You don't have to upload them back to Salesforce before seeing the change. Questions on those? I will talk to you right after the session, and it's a little bit more than we have time for here. Any other questions on that? Okay. So we have a demo app. It's basically a contact app. It's going to show us Salesforce contacts, but it's going to show them to us broken down by account. And when we click on the account, we'll be able to see the contacts for that account. When we click on a particular contact, we'll see details for that contact. Pretty basic. But we're going to wrap this all up, and with just a few lines of HTML and JavaScript, we're going to have a beautiful looking app that we can show off and put on our phone for our users to use. Not only do we have a list view of contacts in the org where we can click and see their details, we also have staged right, which is our own custom navigation on the right. We'll also be able to use staged left to get back to Salesforce1 other objects and applications. And we're also going to pull some data from Salesforce, so you're going to see a data integration using the REST API and how we grab data from Salesforce and put it into our Angular app. I love how it leaves divider subtitle there for me. That was so polite of it. All right. Let's do this. Okay. First things first, let me show you how this app looks running in Salesforce1. If you're not familiar with this little trick, you can actually boot Salesforce1 up in your browser window by going to the URL your instance /1/1.app. That will actually load the same one that's on your phone, but it'll load it here in your browser. So that's what I've done here. And here we have our application. You can see that we've got a list of different accounts broken down by what type of account they are. Are they a direct account or a channel partner? And we've also got our right navigation, our stage right that we can pull up using this little button, or we can actually drag it over with a touch, just like you would expect on a mobile app. Additionally, we can access the stage left from Salesforce1. So now we have standard Salesforce1 navigation as well as our custom navigation built into the app. And if we go here, we can click on Gene Point, I believe is what I clicked on, and we can click on Edna Frank. And here's Edna Frank's details. Oh, and we have a cat picture because cat pictures, or it's a puppy picture, my bad. Puppy pictures power the internet. So we have the details of Edna Frank. We've got a user icon that we can flip out on demand, and a picture we can load from maybe an internal directory, etc. And we have all of these details down here, including the phone number one. Now, if I had a way to demo this on my phone, I would be able to show you that if I click that, it would actually pull up and try and dial the phone number. But in a browser, it's not going to do that. Pretty basic app. We can navigate using the navigation tools. And that's what we got for an app. So let's see how this is all built out. We have in our code, let's make sure that everyone can read this okay. Can everyone see the code all right? Do I need to make it bigger? As I talked about before, you have these tags that you want to add to your Apex page. This is what that functionally looks like. Now, you could put them all in one line, but I want everybody to be able to read it easily, so I broke them down onto individual lines. You want to turn off the header, turn off the sidebar, turn off the standard style sheets. You want to set your doc type to HTML5. And these two are optional, but I turn them off as well. But these four are required. Turning off the apply HTML tag and the apply body tag just tells Visualforce to basically render a blank page if I don't put something in the content. So I'm responsible for drawing my own HTML section with a body, etc., down here at the bottom. Now, like I said, I highly recommend everyone using components. I have two components here. One is Ionic 1 resources. I called my app Ionic 1. And I've got the ngForce resource. These are custom components, and all they do is load a whole bunch of other files for us. So we're doing some style sheet includes here, and I've got mine set up to be able to load from localhost or server side. And if I open up you'll see here that it's actually loading all of our JavaScript files. So rather than having this in all of my view templates, I'm just going to put it in one place and then re-include it. If we go down a little bit further here, we have a tag that is going to pull in a script using some Visualforce data. This Visualforce page is actually going to return a JSON object that gives us the token we need to make REST calls. This is a way you can securely get your access to Salesforce objects and data with the OAuth token through loading a URL page. So we're actually basically including a script here that is a Visualforce page unto itself. It's going to give us back our OAuth token and our username and a couple of other bits of information so that we can securely authenticate back to Salesforce for data integration. And finally, we actually have the start of our application. So if you've ever done any kind of if you've ever done any kind of AngularJS application, you should recognize the ng-app directive on the body tag here. That's how we specify that this is an actual Angular application. But more importantly, down here we have this directive, and this is what a directive looks like in practice. A directive called Ion Nav View. And here in our Ion Nav View, this is what is actually going to set up our Ionic application and provide us the navigation toolbar at the top of the screen. So let me back up here to the application. And when I'm looking at a particular company, that Ionic Nav View is going to provide us this bit of information here, the stack that is our navigation, and a container for subviews. So everything you see below here is a subview of that Ion Nav View. So we get quick and easy navigation with 23 characters. All we have to do is type that in to get our navigation stack set up for various forward and backward motions. And I want to point out that this is fully viable on Android as well as iOS. So you write this JavaScript code here in your HTML, you now have an app that works on both ecosystems for you to get to market. This is a pretty simple page layout, so all we're doing here is starting up our application. When we actually want to do something with our application, we have subviews, and I'm having to read very tiny script here to pull it up. This is a little bit more complicated. Here we have an Ion view. An Ion view is a directive provided by Ionic to give us a subview. In this case, it's going to be a subview of our navigation view. And we set the nav button to be on the right side. And we can set a button toggle as to whether or not what happens when you hit it. And set the class for the actual navigation icon. That's going to give us the icon there. Now, one of the great parts about Ionic and Angular is that all of this is documented to the nth degree on the Ionic site, and you can almost copy and paste some of these basic views to set up your containers. And once you've gotten a feel for how these views act as subviews to the Ionic navigation, you can actually just start whipping these out pretty quickly. You'll see here that I've got some standard double curly brace Angular mix-ins. I'm mixing some data from my controller T here, and I'm doing an ng repeat. And this is a directive that comes with Angular itself, and it allows me to iterate with an iteration variable in a collection. So my view controller, my view model, excuse me, will define what types is, and we'll look at that in just a second. But inside the HTML markup of the page, I can very easily and declaratively set up that I want to do T in types, knowing that types is a variable from my view model. Does that make sense? We're going to be able to iterate over these because I'm giving it T. This is where that's going to show up. You'll see that this is setting up a divider, so we're going to set up two dividers. And those dividers are the darker gray title bars. So this T in types is going to be our channel partner or our direct sales that are listed in our list of companies, our list of accounts. We get down here a little bit further, and we're going to ng repeat account in accounts, and we're going to use a filter directive, or a filter, to lay out which accounts show up in which list, basically. So let me, I'm seeing some blank stares here. Let me demo the app a bit. When I'm in my app and I have the customer channel and the customer direct, these are my types. I'm going to generate one list there and another list there, and it's very washed out on the screen, but if you saw it up here on this one or on my computer screen, you'd see that this is a darker gray box, a little highlighted, separated bit. We're going to use our second ng repeat to list out the account name so that you can click on it, in this case GenePoint or some of the others. And we're going to put an icon on that row that helps the user understand that this is something they can click on and go to a deeper level. So we're going to give it the iOS 7 arrow right. It's the icon on the right for us. Now you'll notice here I'm not directly loading and manipulating images at all. These come from the Ionic JS, or the Ionic directives, templates, and their CSS. There's not a whole lot I have to do here to make this look pretty. That's part of the joy of Ionic. I can declaratively set up my code, my view here, with just what I want it to do, using simple directives like ng repeat, and let it go from there. Now there's one gotcha I want to draw your attention to. If you look very carefully, you'll see that this directive, ion item, and everything in it is actually part of the anchor tag here. If you're developing a Ionic application for Salesforce 1, your navigation view switching links must be wrapped in an anchor tag because of the way Salesforce 1 works. It pre-sanitizes and authorizes your link URLs, and you have to wrap your links here in an anchor tag. Normally, ion item, that directive, will create a link for you. But because it's done at the client side after the page is fully rendered by Salesforce 1, that link isn't approved by Salesforce 1 and it gets rejected. You just end up clicking on it and it just reloads the page and reloads the page. That's the biggest gotcha I've found. Questions on this slightly more complex template? Yes. 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 I'll show you why as we go to the view controller, in fact. Let me grab that controller and put it up on the screen. Yeah. That's a great question. The answer to that is Ionic is specific. Yes, the question was, does Ionic only work with Angular, or can I use, say, Knockout or some other view model-based JavaScript framework? Ionic is currently, and to my knowledge, they have no plans to change this, is currently built on Angular whole in part. It requires Angular to work, but that's a great question. You'll see here in our controller that this is fairly basic JavaScript. We've got some interesting stuff going on, and I'll explain it here. Ionic uses modules for things, and so when you define your application, you define an application module, you give it a name. In our case, our application module is named Ionic1. Now, the module method on Angular is actually both a getter and a setter. If you provide 2 parameters, it's a setter. If you provide 1, it's a getter. So this is how we access our current module and attach new code to it. We're saying, hey, give us the Ionic1 module, and we're going to create a controller on it. In this case, we're going to call it the accounts contact list, and we're going to dependency inject several things here into our controller. Things like scope, which is always required for Angular, state params, log, and SFR query. It says query there, somewhere right about there. And you'll see that the first thing we're doing is we're using one of those dependency injected things, the $log. As a general rule, if it has a $sign in front of it, that came from Angular itself. That's from Google. You can trust it pretty easily. It's good stuff. Other things like SFR query are other modules that you have loaded. Okay? So we're going to put a test message out on the log along with the state params. We're going to throw those state param variables out to our log. And then we're going to use the SFR query module and the query method within that module. So not only can we dependency inject entire modules, we can actually grab hold of their individual methods as well. The SFR query method, as you might imagine, actually runs a query in Salesforce over the Salesforce REST API, hence the SFR, and provides us a whole bunch of information back in a format that Angular can automatically consume. And in fact, by the time we get down to line 6, Angular has already consumed that data back inside of its run loop, and you don't have to worry about synchronizing the run loop. If you've done a lot of Angular development with integration into third parties, that made sense. If not, may you never have to worry about it. You'll see that it's got a callback system set up. It uses promises a lot. So we're going to run the query method with a string query, and then we're going to use the then method to attach a method to it when it's completed. All of the SFR methods, SFR query, et cetera, for our integration library return promises. So we can always use this sort of then bit here. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to assign the scope.contacts method, or scope.contacts variable to be equal to our contacts. Now, I talked about how we had the view model as the sort of the quasi-controller. Now, in Angular, they call that scope. So when you're creating an Angular scope, you have to dependency inject the scope in, but you can then attach variables to it. It's an object. So just like in regular JavaScript, you can define contacts as a method or variable on scope, and then you have access to it inside your view templates. Did that parse okay? It's been a long week for me. I apologize. Likewise, if something happens, you can attach a catch function. This is your error handling in Angular promises. So if something happens, we're going to log the error. Questions, comments, snide remarks on? No, it's something I wrote. It's a open source library on GitHub called ngForce, and it's a library specifically with 6 or 7 modules in it, specifically for interacting with Salesforce in an Angular application. So we have a controller. It's going to provide data to the view, and we're going to be able to switch back and forth between our views to navigate to provide our data. Now, we can also use other methods to grab information from outside of Salesforce as well, because we can mix and match things as needed. So let me pull up the contact card. This is our contact card controller, and this is what happens. This is the controller that is executed when we run a basic, when we're actually viewing a card for a particular contact. It doesn't look all that different from our previous one, does it? The things that are different are the query itself and where we're putting log statements. Put some extra logging in, but it's still basically grab the data from Salesforce in order to view it. That's what provides us the actual card information when we're viewing the card. All of this is configured by a set of files that are known as the application module. We just talked about the application module, in fact. And this is how it's defined. This repo is up on GitHub as noetic penguin /df14. And if you want, you can go in and look at all these files. The Angular people would tell you to have everything in one file. I think that's maddening. So there are actually directories that are too small to read over here that hold things like controllers and directives and keep them separate from one another so you can find what you're wanting to work on. But you always have to specify the actual Angular module. And in this case, we're specifying some controllers in here as well. This has been a pretty good overview of how all this ties together, but I want to make sure that we leave plenty of time for questions and answers. We have 8.5 minutes left. Hit me with questions, or like I said, I'll ask you questions. If you don't mind standing up to one of the microphones to ask the question.
So where does the Angular files and the Ionic files live? Is it, so because it's working with Visualforce, is it going to be in the cloud? Is it going to be in Salesforce? Is it going to live somewhere else?
Yeah, that's a great question. In this situation, for this sample app, the Visualforce, all the JavaScript files needed for this to run live in a static resource on Salesforce's servers. If we go back and look at the component loading those files, you can see that we're using a standard Apex include script tag to bring them in, and we're using URL for our resource to grab them.
So my question relates to this. How would you take something like this and deploy it to a production
That's a great question.
environment, like using Gulp or Grunt for our build process?
You don't even have to worry about that because these live on Salesforce. You can leave all of your controllers, all of your module definitions live in the same static resource. So as you're developing and deploying, you can use localized, local host resources. But then when you go to push it up, you can minify them and concatenate them and put that file into the static resource along with, Ionic and Angular's individual files. That's what I've done on the several apps that are out there right now using this. Great question.
Just talking about, let's say, the mobile SDK from Salesforce, have you tried to put this in on top of the mobile SDK and maybe get offline data? Is that something you've tried to do in the past? Has it worked?
Yeah. So you can, I actually put in 2 topic proposals. One was to talk about building apps with Ionic and the mobile SDK, and one was to put them in Visualforce. I chose this one. It can be done. There are some quirks to it, and it's actually often easier to pull bits of the mobile SDK, like offline access, the Smart Store, into an application like this, rather than trying to go the other way and push this application into the mobile SDK. Okay. Other questions? These have been great.
So is this making use of the JavaScript remoting? Are you doing any remote action stuff on the Apex controller?
That's another good question. So the SFR query that you saw in use actually makes a REST query to Salesforce using the REST API. There are a number of modules provided by ngForce, and one of them is object remoting. You can do object remoting, you can do Visualforce remoting for full methods anywhere in your namespace. You can also use the REST methods. There's also access to the analytics API and the reporting APIs through remoting, or through REST as well. So like I said, there are a number of modules in there. Some of them are specifically written to help you with templating and using Visualforce pages as your templates. So in our situation here, we saw HTML files that were stored inside the static resource bundle used as our view templates. But we can actually also use a full-on Visualforce page with its own controller and other data associated with it and pull that in as a view into Ionic. There wasn't going to be enough time to demo that as well.
Hi. At the first page, you were loading some configuration. You mentioned that. Can you show us what are you doing on that page?
Which page?
At the beginning, you're doing a configuration page. You're loading as a JSON with a script tag.
This one?
No, at the code level.
Oh, the code level. Okay. This one?
That page, Angular_config. You mentioned that you were doing some wow stuff. What else are you doing on that page? Thank you.
This page, all it does is pull in the resources. Yes, I can actually show it to you. I'm sorry, I misunderstood the question. So this is the Angular config Visualforce page. You can see that it's also not it's turning off the header and the sidebar, and we set the content type to JavaScript. When this page is served by the Salesforce servers, it'll be rendered with all of the Visualforce stuff merged in, but it will also give it to us back as JavaScript, inserted with JavaScript. So when we pull it in as a script resource on our master application page, the one we were just looking at, what you end up with is getting this back as a JSON object that you can parse and load into the Angular module for ngForce config. This is going to specifically give us the session ID, the site prefix, and the resource URL. That resource URL is if you want to grab particular HTML files or icons, images, that sort of stuff out of your static resource bundle. That static resource bundle is what comes in here, the URL for the resource where things are stored. This is somebody actually contributed this back to the repository as a pull request, and it's been a fantastic improvement to how it works, being able to pull this information in through this.
Yeah, my next question was going to be on HTML5 push state. How does routing work with a Salesforce page like that?
So Angular and Ionic, so let me back up. Ionic uses a technology from Angular that is going to be this default in Angular 2, but right now is optional, called UI router. UI router doesn't work by navigating between pages, it navigates between states. And as a result of which, it's a kind of a bit of a mind bender when you first get into it, but what it allows you to do is define a state, say home, and that home will have its own controller and its own view associated with it. And then there's a special directive tag called UI sref, and that UI state reference one will actually be what translates you between page A and page B. That's how Ionic works under the covers, and they provide you all those like list items, the Ionic list item that automatically generate the UI sref for you to click on. They, however, do not work in Salesforce1, either in the browser or on your phone. They work fine in Visualforce. Just if you want to build a Visualforce app with this, you can. But on Salesforce1, you have to wrap those in anchor tags. And push state and Salesforce1 are not friends.
You mentioned that GitHub.
Yeah. I think I actually have it
spell it?
as a slide here. Let me put that up while we're doing questions and answers. Yeah, here we go. So this is the repository on GitHub. I didn't give you the full URL, but you can github.com/noeticpenguin/ionic on Visualforce. And if you want the full application, the demo application that I built, instead of being Ionic on Visualforce, it's df14. Dreamforce 14. Yes, sir.
With Salesforce's Lightning and the Aura component coming up, is that something in the roadmap for Ionic as well?
I don't believe that Ionic is going to be building components for Lightning. I could be wrong. I don't speak for them. I think they have a bigger, broader audience in mind than just Salesforce developers. That said, the thinking behind Ionic with its directives is very similar to the way that components in Lightning work. And so if you were building your own directives and your own views, et cetera, that's going to be almost a one-to-one like migration to a Lightning component. Okay. All the resources on Angular that talk to you about how to build directives and that sort of thing, they are, in my opinion, a good resource to learn the sort of thinking and methodology. Directives have self-contained logic that applies only to within that directive, and Lightning components are very similar. They've got controllers that can be associated with them either server-side or locally on the client that are limited to just the execution of that block of code. Other questions?
I'm new to mobile development, but so from what you showed in the demo, if there are at least 2 queries written in each of your controllers.
Yes.
Or view model. So thinking about the scale, so if you have 1,000 user Salesforce environment and several clicks is 1 query each, are we worried about the API limits, REST API limits, query limits? For demo, this is great, but when we put it in production, how does that work?
That's a great question. And there are many answers to that because this specifically talks about on Visualforce inside Salesforce 1. The answer to your question is to turn around and use Visualforce remoting rather than a REST call. I did a REST call because when I was writing this, I had been doing REST calls all day in my other project. But you could use, the module there is called VFR, Visualforce remoting, and the methods are largely the same. So VFR.query is going to act just the same as SFR query.query. In production, I have an app that is used by 800 daily. It's growing, and they don't run into API limits. What they do is, or what happens is the data is cached locally. So in the Ionic and AngularJS stack, there's a built-in HTTP sort of REST client that's going to go get data, and if that data is from the same URL, it will be cached until it runs out of caching spots. It has a fixed buffer of data space for cache, and you'll oftentimes, like if you navigate back from one state to another, it's not going to rerun the query because it has that data still stored in a cache. We are 3.5 minutes over time, but I will happily answer a few more questions out in the hallway.